There's a certain sound that only exists in the middle of nowhere. It's not the wind. It's not a truck on the distant road. It's the small, human noises that become enormous when there's nothing else to drown them out. The slow, steady press of boots across a tin roof, the dry click of a screen door being tapped 3 times, the soft, impossible breathing that seems to belong to the house itself. If you've ever sat in a cabin with the world shut away, you know how those small things widen until they take up the whole night. I've been collecting these kinds of stories for years. Notes passed to me over a kitchen table, messages left on an answering machine, a person stopping me after a reading to whisper, "This happened to my cousin," and then leaving before I can ask another question. Tonight, I want to tell you 10 of them. Some were sent in, some I heard in the flesh. All of them happened in cabins where the trees breathe close and the nearest neighbor is a rumor. None of the tellers insist they know exactly what it was. That's the point. The truth lives in the way ordinary things, footsteps, lights, a dog's whine, refuse to add up. 1. He came up to the roof in 6 slow steps. I got that line from a postcard slid under my door, handwritten, edges softened by rain. The writer signed only with a first name and a county, Oregon. She sent a photograph too, a slope of pine trees capped in powder, a thin track of boot prints cutting through untouched snow toward a squat cabin. The story was a knot of grief and small terror. She'd gone back to her family cabin for the first winter since her father died. The house had been in the family a long time. Bad paint, a sag in the porch, a rusted bell at the gate that she never rang. It was the kind of place you go to when you need silence and the smell of old books. She took the dog Midnight, a black lab with 2 white hairs at his chin that made him look like he'd forgotten how to grow up. On the second night, there was a storm. The road was cut off, the power flickered, and that flat, cold quiet settled like a hand over the place. At first, it was just prints in the snow. New, crisp, too small for a boot, but the spacing was human. They crossed the yard past the porch and stopped at the old stone well. Midnight stood at the window and stared, neck muscles taut. He wouldn't stop staring. The woman wrapped herself in a blanket and kept the lamp low. The house felt too bright when she turned everything on. She watched the prints through the kitchen window with a kind of attention that was part calculation, part prayer. They were alone. There should be no footprints but theirs. Later in the house, she heard steps above her, 6 of them deliberate and soft, not walking through the house so much as measuring it from the outside, one at the eave, one nearer the chimney, another toward the back peak. Midnight's ears moved. He pressed himself against the small of her leg so hard she thought his bones would crack. The footsteps stopped directly over the bedroom. Then there was a tap at the screen door, 3 slow, measured taps, and a pause. She said she felt both very small and very far away at once. Grief has a way of shrinking you down until things press in. The people who call to you while you're small will find an easier voice. She cracked the door with a kitchen knife in her hand, expecting a stranger. The porch was empty. There were no footprints on the boards, no smudge of boot tread, nothing in the lamplight but a single dark smudge on the screen door, like someone's palm had rested there, too soft to leave a mark on snow, but darker against the mesh. She kept Midnight close and slept with the lamp on. In the morning, the yard was pristine, as if the night had been a dream, and the snow had been the only witness. She remembered a crouched figure at the edge of the property, a motionless silhouette in the limbs of a pine, like it had been carved from wood and left there to watch. But in daylight the pine seemed empty. She found no prints up the trunk and no place where someone could have perched. She told herself the storm and the dark were actors, and she had been a poor judge. She hasn't been back to the cabin since. She sells the postcard every once in a while. It's tucked into a drawer. I asked her if she believed in ghosts. She wrote back, "I don't know. I just know the house heard me that night and answered in a language I couldn't understand." If you're into these late-night stories, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest. 2, she was nearly solid, like a woman who belonged to another century. This came from a woman in Missouri, the kind of place where family reunions are an excuse to rent a cabin for the week. The property was generational, a circle of cabins down by a slow bend in a river, picnic tables thick with varnish from many summers, a rope swing over mud. 2 cousins, both in their 20s, were watching the little kids sleep. It was late, but not very late. The air still held the heat of the day. They were in the kitchen when one of them heard a noise at the doorway, the kind of soft rustle that could belong to a bag of chips or a person checking on a sleeping child. They looked up and saw a woman standing in the doorway, lit by the sodium yellow of the porch light. She wore a dress that was wrong, not a modern dress, but one that hit the ankle and closed at the throat. Her hair was a soft knot at the nape, and there was something about the way she held herself that wasn't in tune with the little electronics and plastic toys of the cabin. The cousins froze. The woman smiled in a way that made the back of both their necks prickle. Her smile was small and steady and oddly kind. Both cousins said the same things. She walked to the crib, lingered there as though checking the children's breathing, then looked up at them. Her eyes were compassionate, almost pleading. She said nothing. After a long moment she backed away, turned her face briefly toward the river, and then floated out into the night as if the trees held a door she could pass through. The porch light blinked. When one cousin turned on the kitchen light, the woman was gone. They checked the yard with flashlights, called out, walked to the riverbank. Nothing. The footprints around the cabin were theirs. Barefoot children, 1 dog, and nothing else. Yet both cousins insisted separately that the woman had wanted to make sure the children were safe. They described a feeling like being given an order and a benediction at once. No one else at the reunion had seen her. The 2 girls left after the week, and their family has not returned to that cluster of cabins since. They talk about the woman with something like wonder, not fear, so much as reverence. One of the cousins sent me a photograph from a distance, a smear of white in the doorway that could have been a trick of long exposure. In the margins of a letter she wrote, she had penciled a single sentence. She didn't want to hurt us, but she was not from our time. 3. We woke to boots pacing inside the house. A family in Maine, all piled into one bedroom because the storm had folded the rest of the house into a single hot room, heard heavy boots that paced around the cabin in a slow, anxious rhythm. The boots were not light. They had a certain heft, like work boots with soles that counted the floor. The sound paused at the foot of their bed, then moved on. Father grabbed a machete from the shed and burst into the hallway, shouting. The sound stopped as soon as he opened the door. There was nothing in the hallway. The front door was latched, the windows were closed and frost-panned. The dog, who had been whining in the corner, was now quiet and staring at the ceiling. The family searched every room with flashlights, and the flashlight beams trembled over a dust-free set of floors. No footsteps marked the floorboards, no scuffs on the rugs. The only evidence the boots had ever existed was the impression left in the narrator's memory, the way the sound could take on the size of a solid person. They told me the father sat with the machete for the rest of the night, every sense raked to the point of exhaustion. The family moved out several weeks later, and the children, now older, refused to sleep in anything but a hotel when they visit that part of Maine. The father took to locking the doors twice and checking the windows with the same obsessive care he uses in the off-season to check the boat. You can't prove a presence with a machete, but you can make yourself feel safer carrying one. 4. There was a man in the trees staring at us through the glass. This one's from a group renting an Airbnb near Big Bear. They were city people who thought a cabin would be an easy way to feel away without being entirely uncomfortable. It was tucked onto a steep slope. Trees gathered around like an audience. On the first night, they noticed a silhouette among the trunks. A large man who didn't move, just watched. The motion lights at the edge of the property would flicker on for a second when cars passed the road. But these lights stayed off. When one of the renters walked to the back window to get a better look, the man didn't move. He stood with his hands at his sides, a dark, patient shape. They called the number on the Airbnb listing. The host said there had been no activity on the cameras and no one by that house. They thought about calling the sheriff, but the area is the sort of place where a call takes an hour to return. They drew the curtains and laughed to relieve the tension, but laughter in small rooms with strangers is brittle. Later that night, the power went out. Not a flicker. Every light, every phone, every device swallowed whole. They checked the circuit box. Somehow the streetlights were still on. The house was a black thing. Without the glow from the town, they could not see the shape where the man had been. They tripped down the stairs, knocking over chairs and breathless. But when they threw open the doors to the deck, there was no one. Only the trees breathing and a single wet footprint on the wooden step that seemed too small for a man. They called the sheriff in the morning. The reports from the utility company said there had been no outage that night in that grid. The host said the house's cameras had malfunctioned and produced only corrupted files for the evening. The renters left early. The company that runs the listings told them it was strange but not unprecedented, and that they should file a claim for their rental fee. The men in uniform who came to check only took a written statement and left with polite detachment. 5. The loft floor was covered in flies, thousands of them frozen in place. I don't usually include break-ins, but this one isn't about theft. A young couple trespassed, this is how they put it. They admitted it freely, into an overgrown cabin on private land. They'd been together for a while and liked exploring. In the daylight, the woods looked like paper cutouts and the cabin like a stage prop. The door gave with a rotten sigh. Inside, the smell was the kind that clings to old wood and something older than the wood, a sweetness like dried fruit left too long. At first they thought the living room was simply dust-ridden. Then she climbed the ladder to the loft. At the top of the ladder she froze. The loft, which had once been full of quilts and boxes, was a landscape of little bodies, flies, thousands of them pinned to the boards. Not alive, not strewn about as if scattered by some great breeze. Rather, each one lay like a thing scheduled into place by an exacting hand. Sunlight through the single window made their wings shine like a field of moth-eaten coins. The woman's companion laughed at first, a nervous, small sound, and then the weight of it struck him too. The flies had been preserved. They looked as though someone had arranged them to cover certain planks and not others, as if demarcating a pattern the two trespassers could not quite map. She said later, when she told the story, she wasn't bragging, just describing, that her skin crawled in a way no disease could explain. They left quickly. The man wanted to take photographs. The woman wanted to get home. On the way out, they found a thin, sealed phone book sitting by the hearth, pages uncut, address pages still blank. On the road, they argued small things about whether they were reckless, whether the house belonged to anyone. The man insisted the flies meant something ritual, an offering or a warning. The woman insisted the cabin had simply been left to rot. That night the woman couldn't sleep. She found herself picturing those flies again, their wings like pale coins. She woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of something small skittering behind the bedroom wall. The next day she called the man and ended it over the phone. She said she couldn't reconcile how calm he was when they were in the house. He had been almost casual in his curiosity. She wanted with all the soft, desperate hunger of a person trying to make a life, not to be a person who laughed while someone else froze. Between the stories, there's always a moment I live for, a kind of hush where the teller waits to see if I will raise an eyebrow. And I don't. I want these accounts to sit straight on their feet. People who've spent nights alone in cabins learn to notice the way a house will ask a question and then refuse to wait for an answer. 6. A sealed phone book sat next to our fire, like a sign someone had been there. The phone book motif recurs. Not surprising, perhaps. It's such a domestic object, the kind that shouldn't exist in a place so far from town. In this next testimony from an off-grid build site, the phone book is a stage prop in a slowly escalating set of intrusions that made men who were used to plywood and circuit diagrams feel cornered. A group of friends were building a cabin in a field that rolled into sparse woodland. They had a fire pit and a porta-potty, and a sense that the work would be done by fall. One morning, they found a new, still-sealed phone book placed near the pit. The book wasn't theirs. No one in the group owned a phone line. They used cell service and a satellite that came and went like a curious animal. The book was too precise, fresh as if someone had carefully ordered it and left it there as a gesture. That same week, they noticed tracks crossing where there should have been none. An outline in the damp earth as if someone had walked steady and then stopped to listen. They set up trail cams, propped them on logs, and came back the third day to find the cameras twisted to face the woods, their lenses smeared and one of them missing. When they did catch motion on the remaining footage, the figure recorded was always in the periphery, half-shaped, like a person who kept stepping back into the trees. One night they found a flashlight beam laid across the smoke of their small fire, as if someone had thrown light deliberately to see them. No one greeted it. When they moved to look, a pair of headlights flashed at the roadside and then vanished. Equipment was stolen, tarps, chainsaws, small things, but the sort of theft that changes your sense of safety from inconvenience to menace. They tried posting no trespassing signs and setting up higher cameras. The cameras were sabotaged. Once they found a pair of boots lined up neatly by the sleeping bag, toes pointing at the tent, as if a visitor had sat on the cold earth and arranged them while the men slept. They stopped sleeping in the cabin. 2 of them stayed in town in a motel and took turns making coffee in the night. The one who lived nearest to the site began to carry a pistol and, this detail matters, started sleeping with the light on. They invited a neighbor to stand guard for a night. The neighbor came and sat with them, quiet and watchful. At 3 a.m., he told them he had seen a shadow stop on the far slope, tilt its head like an animal listening, then dissolve into the black. He had never told them anything about what he had seen until he was asked directly. His hands trembled in the way a long-time builder's hands do when carrying fuel. The men found themselves arguing about a thing no one could solve. Was it a man who decided this field was a free place to cut through, or was it a thing that pretended to be a man? Their accounts diverged in small ways. Was the boot toe blunt or sharp? Did the light feel like a human's cast, or like something that slices space for reasons of its own? They barricaded their tools, changed their routines, and eventually put the project on hold. The land has a way of deciding when you are welcome. There's a particular kind of quiet after stories of trespass and sabotage. It's not silence so much as an intake of breath. Listeners imagining a heavy step outside their own door. The next 2 tales move toward things that are less obviously human. 7. An orb led us to a cabin. On the table, a skull sat like a thing waiting for company. This one came to me in a letter that smelled faintly of suntan oil and seawater. The writer grew up in Florida and wrote in a style that leaned hard on what she'd seen as a child. She said it altered her life in a way she hadn't expected. It began at the edge of play. She and a group of kids were playing hide-and-seek near a thicket where the ground fell away. The afternoon was a place you could lose time in easily. Sound bright in the pines, the air thick with the odor of salt and something sweet. One of the children pointed and said, "Look." There was a small floating light, no bigger than a softball, bobbing above the bracken. It was not wavering like a firefly. It moved with a purpose, an intelligence. As the kids watched, it traced a path through the underbrush and then stopped as if waiting. The orb was white with a faint gold core, and when it turned toward them, it seemed to designate a way. Curiosity carried them. They followed the orb down a slope they had never explored, and, to this day, the woman says, they found a small cabin tucked into a tree line. Inside, on the table under a thin layer of dust, sat a skull turned just so, a single jar beside it, clear, with something dark suspended like a heart, its cork intact. The children fled. They told their parents, who found the cabin the next day and called the sheriff. The sheriff found evidence later that a body had been found in the area months prior and that someone had been living there, off-grid. A search resulted. I pressed for names. The woman gave one and then apologized, saying she couldn't share the details she'd read in the police report. She remembers the orb as either guiding them to the place of truth or luring them toward danger. Even now, she says it feels indecent to think about that day without a wash of shame and fear. Later in life, she would see the same orb. Once at a bus stop in another state, a pale light above the shelter, and once in a fogged window in college. Sometimes it led her to places where bodies were later found. Other times it pointed at small, harmless things. A cat in a tree, a missing dog. She never learned whether the orb is a guardian or a predator, and she ends her letter by saying, "That's the trouble with things that look small and clever. They don't answer when you ask them what they want." 8. Footsteps circled the house in the mud, but the mud never showed them. An older woman, her grandchildren now grown, wrote to me about nights she spent in her grandparents' cabin in the heaviest part of Minnesota. It was a place where summers stretched slow and winters came hard. When she was a child, she sometimes stayed overnight with her grandmother and woke to a particular sound, slow, gravelly footsteps that rounded the perimeter of the house. They sounded close enough to dent the air, but in the morning, the mud outside showed no prints at all. The grandmother would laugh this off in the morning and tell the child to go back to bed, but the child would watch the window long after the light changed. Once when a cousin came to stay, and there was a thunderstorm that made the sky a folded cloth, they both woke to a low murmur that seemed to come from the middle of the room. It was like someone speaking into a bowl, soft vowels without words. The cousin called out, "Who's there?" The sound stopped. They sat in bed and listened to the rain. In the morning there were no signs anyone had been there, only a strange citrus-like smell the grandmother insisted was some kind of plant oil. She told them stories about the woods in the old tongue, about boundaries that should not be crossed. The granddaughter believed these stories for a long while, and then stopped believing them entirely until she was old enough to realize that belief and fear are separate things. She wrote that the dog, her grandmother's hound, who had lived a life of slow naps and sudden bursts of interest, would sometimes whine and refuse to go outside in the morning as if he had been expecting company in the yard. The woman's final line read like a note left on a kitchen counter. "We were never alone, not really. Sometimes alone is an agreement with the world, and sometimes it is only because everyone else stopped listening." 9. I felt my body go heavy, and a perfect black hole opened in my bedroom. This is one where the boundary between sleep and wake becomes a place the witness could no longer control. A man who owned a small wooded property, old enough to have maps that called it backlot, began to describe a sensation he had after wandering among curious moss mounds there. He'd go deeper than usual, crouch in hollows, and sometimes leave tokens, small things he found on the ground. One spring he began waking at the same hour with the same pressure. His body would be too heavy to move, and he would watch as something like a void settled at the foot of his bed, a perfect, unreflective black circle that swallowed the light from his nightstand. He felt a presence sit in that blackness, and for a moment the thing seemed to be listening to him, as if he were a story being retold. The dog outside, the one named Gus, who had a bark like a folding chair, would sit against the door and whine. Only once did the man open his eyes and see a shape step away from the black circle, a shadow that was almost just the absence of the room, and then nothing. He attributed some of the first episodes to classic sleep paralysis. He'd read the articles, tried to sleep on his back, took melatonin, drank less coffee. But the episodes began to leak into the day. Pieces of the forest seemed to hold the same blackness in their hollows. When he crouched down in the scoring shadows, the ground itself felt like it could be a throat. He stopped telling people about the black circle because people, being kind, told him to see a doctor. People, being cruel, told him to drink less. The more he narrated the experience to himself, the more convinced he was that whatever woke in that room at night had been awakened by his trespass into the moss mounds. The dog began to stay close, to the point of resting his head on the man's leg, even when the man was outside. Dogs make better readers of danger than human eyes. He told me he still goes out sometimes, but he leaves an offering, a small tin, a coin, on the path, and walks around it 3 times before he goes home. He says it makes him feel safe in the way that ritual does, an attempt to keep the place from noticing him too sharply. 10. There was a single paw-shaped print on the inside of the glass, wet on the outside, dry on the inside. I promised 10. The 10th in this portion of our night is short and sharp, an anonymous submission that came in as a text message at 2:12 a.m. A time, oddly, when people make decisions to tell someone the smallest, worst things. The writer said they were alone in a cabin for the first time. The house sat at the edge of a lake, and the windows framed a line of trees like teeth. They went out for a smoke and heard a tapping at the sliding glass door. Soft, 3 beats, then a pause, then 3 more, like Morse code written in knuckles. It matched their heart. They stepped back, watching, and the tapping shifted along the glass in perfect cadence with their own pulse. They pressed their palm to the glass and discovered a single paw-shaped print on the inside, where the animal's digits had been pressed against the pane. Outside, dew sat on the glass where the paw had been. Inside, the pad was dry. They say they left immediately, stayed at a motel, and returned in daylight with a friend who laughed and called it condensation. The writer said the paw was there still, silent and patient, and that the house seemed to breathe once when they left. There are noises that cling to you like an old habit, the ones you rehearse in your mind in the quiet hours, and there are the noises you can't explain away. For many of these storytellers, it's the smallness of the thing that makes the fear last. A tap, a print, a phone book, a jar. The more ordinary the sign, the worse it is when it refuses to be ordinary. We're almost halfway through the list I promised. These first 10, no. Tonight I promised 10 total, and so far the room is full of their voices. But there are more to tell, and some of them are the kind that widen into long, slow mornings. Some of these people still sleep with their lamps on. Some refuse to go back. The decking of footprints in the snow, the woman from another century, the man in the trees, the preserved flies, the orb that may be a guide or a snare. All of them circle around the same thing. Cabins are thresholds, places where the private and the wild meet and sometimes keep each other company. Before I go further, I'll say this. If one of these stories lands on you like the sudden scrape of a branch against a window, tell me about it in the comments. Sometimes knowing there's someone else who heard the same thing helps make it a little less like a voice inside your skull. There's one more thing I'll ask at the end of the night, but for now, keep whatever light you have handy. There's a line I want to follow into the rest of these nights. An image that keeps returning, a single pair of boots on a porch, untouched by snow. The stories that follow pick up where these left off. Some bring police cars, some bring unanswered knocks, some are quieter, like a house clearing its throat. The next one I want to tell is from a neighbor who slept in a guest room and woke to the sound of someone speaking his name in a voice he recognized like a pocketed coin. He said the voice was in the room, but there was no mouth. He reached for his phone, and the battery was dead, though it had been full 2 minutes before. He found the curtains folded back and a smear on the glass that matched neither weather nor animal. He told no one for weeks. The months that followed rearranged his sense of what was possible. That night, well, that account needs more room than I have here. There's a pattern to these nights, and it's not just the fear. It's the way people change after they hear the house speak. Some move away. Some stop laughing at old wives' tales. Some, like the woman in Oregon, lock away the memory like a postcard in a drawer. But others keep the memory close and find that it keeps going quietly with them. The rest of these tales, about a sheriff who found nothing, about a family that left in the morning, about a builder who caught a shadow on camera, need time to breathe. For now, imagine a tin roof in the rain and the slow, patient sound of something walking above it. The trees will probably hear, the house will remember. There's a line I want to follow into the rest of these nights, an image that keeps returning. A single pair of boots on a porch, untouched by snow. The next account I'm going to tell came from a neighbor who overheard something that sounded like a man speaking his name right inside the guest room where he was sleeping. He didn't send a postcard. He knocked on my door. He had the look of someone who'd rehearsed his story in the dark so many times he could tell it without the tremor that usually gives things away. He lived half a mile down a gravel lane from a cluster of cabins older than mailbox numbers. He'd been staying in the guest room of an older friend's place while the friend was in town for a funeral. The house was the sort that keeps its own temperature, cool in summer and cavernous in winter. The guest room faced the trees. The curtains had a habit of moving, even when the windows were latched. He told me he'd fallen asleep with the radio on low, the kind of static music that keeps a room from eating its own echoes. At 2 a.m, something called his name. Not a shout, not the thin, clipped calling of someone standing in the hall, just his name, spoken from somewhere in the room in a voice that held a private familiarity like a coin with a thumbprint. He blinked awake and felt the air beside his bed press down like someone had sat on the covers. He reached for the radio, but the dial spun uselessly. The station was gone. He fumbled for his phone to check the time, and the battery read 0. He swore it had been full before he'd closed his eyes. The voice spoke again, the syllables close enough to have been whispered into his ear. "Tom," it said, his name. He answered stupidly like you answer a phone. "Who's there?" The voice stopped. He swung the lamp on with hands that felt foreign. The curtains were folded back in a rough, even line. There was a smear on the glass, like someone had dragged a thumb slowly across the pane and then wiped it away in a hurry. No footsteps in the dirt outside. The porch showed only the weather. No one on the driveway. When he told me how his mouth had tasted of iron, how he'd slept the rest of the night with the light on and the TV blaring like a claim, he said something small that is easy to miss until you try to sleep after midnight. It was the familiarity that got to me. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a forgotten promise. He stayed with his friend for 2 more nights and then checked into a motel. He stopped by the cabin later with a cup of coffee and a determination to be brave. The friend laughed at him and said the house had always made noises. The friend's father used to call it old bones. The smear on the glass was gone. The friend had been away, but the guest room had been locked and untouched. The neighbor left the key in the dish and drove back down the lane with his hands on the steering wheel, hands that had learned how to find their own pulse. A week later, the sheriff's office called him back to say they'd taken a report. A transient had been camping in the woods a mile down the road and had been given a warning, but no one had entered the house. No one had gone through the door. The neighbor shrugged and said he knew this part of the county had its share of people who wandered and left strange things in their wake. But the voice calling his name hadn't sounded like a man sleeping on a riverbank. It had sounded like someone who had been listening for him for a long time. That detail, the little human fact that makes us double over and examine our own memory, is what I go looking for. Things that could be a burglar can also be something that remembers you. It's the same taste of unease, whether you call it human or not. On a later night, I was sent a thicker envelope with court-stamped paper inside. It was from a man whose family had called the sheriff after the power outage at the Big Bear rental. He'd written the statement himself and folded it with the meticulous, guilty patience of someone who wants everything to be recorded correctly. His report said the cameras had returned corrupted footage. A single frame at 3:14 a.m. showing a shape on the deck, blurred, like a smear of putty against the world. The sheriff, the man told me, had squinted at the file and said, "It's probably a raccoon or a trick of the lens," and then slid the hard drive back across the desk. They took no prints. But off the record, one of the deputies told the renter something he later repeated to me with the weary humour of someone who has seen 100-odd things and keeps them in a ledger. The deputy said he'd been to other cabins on that same slope and that sometimes cameras just die for reasons you can't explain. That phrase, reasons you can't explain, is the polite shorthand for something else. People who spend nights in wiring and wood start to believe in respectable inconveniences and less respectable audiences. The deputy had put it kindly, but the renter left the sheriff's office with the sensation that there was an argument being made somewhere else, between whatever watched the trees and the men who patrolled the roads. I wanted to ask the man about the man in the trees again. Did he remember what the hands looked like? Was the footprint really too small for a man? He told me with reserve that memory thins like old rope. Each time he tried to pull at the recollection, the fibers came loose. He only knew that when the outage swallowed the house, everything that watched them went still. The way some animals flatten themselves until you think they no longer exist is how the world behaves when you have no light. Our habit is to fill that stillness with our imaginations. Some other habits fill it with patience. Not all intrusions are shadowy watchers in the trees. Sometimes the intrusion is the scale of small things arranged with a patience you can't bear. The couple who found the flies, for example. My mailbag still has a photograph from the woman who fled that loft. She didn't need the picture. She gave it to me as if she wanted to distribute the feeling. The photo is soft, the way old film makes a room feel like a memory on purpose. In it, endless pale shapes lay in a pattern the human eye wants to decode and cannot. The woman told me that later, months after the breakup, she returned to the house with a friend who was a field biologist. The biologist walked the floor slowly and kept saying the same thing. These are not natural. These were arranged. Nay, he suggested it might have been some kind of folk taxidermy, a practice she had never heard of before, but his voice also betrayed his disbelief. They knocked on the owner's door after the state's record showed no one had been registered at that property for years. The owner was an old man who had left 3 decades earlier and now denied ownership. He said the land had been willed to a charity. The charity had no funds and even less interest in settling the dust of an old cabin. At night, the woman told me, small things rearrange you. What was previously only a frisson becomes a rift in the self. She wrote to me once in a short, direct email, "I don't know what makes someone make a pattern like that. I only know I heard a laugh from downstairs once when I thought I was alone." She left out what the laugh sounded like. I assumed that was deliberate. There is a kind of logic to the off-grid builder's experience that starts simple and acquires menace by the accumulation of small wrongnesses. The phone book, the boot outline, the camera lenses smeared with something oily. None of those things on its own would have been terrifying. Taken together, they rhinoceros charge your sense of home. One of the builders wrote a long message about the nights he sat on the porch with a thermos and a gun, 2 cheap comforts that made him feel less naked. He told me how, after the cameras were sabotaged, they tried to bait the intruder, bait being another polite word, and left food near the pit. In the morning the food was untouched but arranged, like it had been placed in a circle and then counted into tidy piles. Once you let the woods see you make a habit of funerals, it seems to keep attending. We think of trespass as a human malice, someone with a mean intention who edges across your property line. But many of the witnesses I talked to eventually admit that whatever crossed those fields wasn't always human-shaped. The neighbor who visited and sat that one night to keep watch told the builders a story about a deer that walked a fence line and left no prints. He was a man who had sharpened metal for years and had no patience for myth. Still, he sat up at that porch until the grey began, and at one point he swore he saw a figure on the slope tilt its head like an animal listening. He told the builders, in the exact register of someone who has stopped going for the rational explanation, that the figure moved with the slowness of judgment. The builders abandoned the project 2 months later, and one of their number took a job helping to build an RV park where there were lights at every turn. Lights do strange things in the woods. They both give and take away. The orb that led the children in Florida is a story that blooms in 10 different corners of the envelope of a life. The woman who wrote to me became complicit in her own curiosity. She admitted it plainly. She followed the bright and clever thing because she was a child, and because children are, in their particular way, very good at recognizing patterns. Later, as an adult, the orbs returned to unexpected places. The bus stop, the college fogged window, began to form a life theme for her. For years, she kept a little book of sightings. She wrote how the orb would appear at the edges of events it could not explain. A missing dog found, the discovery of a body, the revelation of something small and true. She fell into superstition like a person falling into a weathered coat. As she grew older, she tried to test it. She would wait at a train station at odd hours, watching for the more than insect. Sometimes it appeared and pointed at something small and mortal. A cat, a lost glove. Once it led her to a man who had been sleeping in a doorway, and when she called authorities, he was found to have an old wound no one had noticed. She told me she sometimes thought the orb was a thief of tragedies. It took from the world in increments and gave back puzzles. She couldn't decide whether to be grateful or afraid. It arrived like the solution to a riddle, she wrote, but the solution was always only more riddle. That ambivalence, gratitude threaded with suspicion, appears in so many of these testimonies. The Missouri cousins who saw the woman from another century felt protected, and yet they could not stop the feeling that kindness separated from time is itself a kind of danger. The 2 cousins told me once that afterward they noticed small things, the way their children slept without stirring, the way the river seemed to carry questions. One grew solemn and became a teacher of children, perhaps out of that impulse to keep the small safe. The other sold her corner of the property and moved to a city where the lights made ghosts less credible. What tends to unnerve me most is not the spectacle, the figure in a doorway, the footprint on the glass, but the ways people change after the encounter. The man from Maine bought a lockbox for his machete and kept it within arm's reach. The builder started sleeping with his boots on by the door. The woman from Oregon left the house and has not returned. Fear reorganizes priorities. It also invents rituals. There are those who take an anchor against the world in the form of small offerings. The man who walks around the moss mounds, leaving a coin and circling it, told me he knows the gesture is absurd. He also knows that he feels safer doing it than not. The ritual is a handshake offered to the world that is not about belief so much as the logic of attention. You notice something when you are willing to do the small human thing that says, "I will not be taken without trying." It's not protection in any metaphysical sense. It's a way of refusing passivity. Sometimes the after effects manifest as a social rot. Relationships fray because one partner is braver in the face of strangeness than the other. That was true in the couple who left the loft. The woman told me she was frightened by how casually her partner made jokes about the flies, as if they were an interesting find rather than the ring around a well. That casualness felt like a betrayal in the presence of something the woman experienced as deeply intimate. She said she had dreamed the loft for months. and seen the flies as an omen of decay and attention that her partner did not see because he had a worker's mind, what could be catalogued and classified rather than felt. Not all of these tales end with people moving away. Some people stay and find ways to live with the memory like a faint scent that returns with humidity. An elderly woman in a mountain village wrote to me about her late husband's cabin that remained empty for years after he died. She wrote about how the house would sometimes play recordings, that is, a cassette tape or a radio station, of songs he had liked at times when he would have wanted them to play. She attributed it to wiring and phantom feeds, and I offered my usual shrug. Old houses do strange things. But she insisted it was his voice deciding to keep a small company. Whether that's sentiment or signal is immaterial. It gave her solace. I think people live with things by telling stories. That is the narrow, necessary honesty of what I do. Many of my correspondents write not because they need me to believe them. There is an economy of disbelief they are used to, but because they need to arrange the things in order, like laying out tools on a bench. When you say the words, your memory sits straighter. You can look at it and say, yes, this happened, and then put it away. One of the more complicated follow-ups came from a man whose property had the moss mounds and who had experienced the black circle. Over time, his episodes became less frequent, but the things he left on the path remained religious in their smallness. A beer cap, a coin, a small toy. He told me this as if it were a funny thing that he had become ceremonial in his neglect. Once, he wrote, he found the toy arranged in front of the blackness like a gift. He didn't want to take it. He waited until the morning, and then burned it in the fire pit with a slow, careful hand. He kept a page torn from an old calendar with the day circled. He told me he could not say whether burning the toy relieved the blackness or merely soothed his own nervousness. His language is typical of these letters, both hopeful and precise to the point of obsession. If there's a pattern to these nights, it's that wilderness is not empty in the way people assume. That is both a literal observation, trees host animals, gullies collect weather, and an idea. Places retain the memory of what happens in them. Houses especially have a quality of remembering because they are stitched with domestic acts, cups, beds, the rhythm of someone leaving and someone returning. When those acts are interrupted by a death, by a theft, by a new weight like grief or a stranger's foot, the house keeps the imprint. Once, after months of letters, I took a drive with one of the people who'd written to me. Just me and a woman who'd fled the country cabin with midnight. She brought the postcard, the well photograph, and the cup of tea that tasted like something her father used to drink. We sat at the kitchen table as dusk came like a soft hand, and she told me more of what she had not written. She remembered warm breath on the back of her neck as midnight had whined. She thought she heard someone humming a lullaby out by the well. She swore, with a calm that made me pay attention, that the presence that night had been less predatory than possessed of patience. The house answering a question it had always known. She did not call it a ghost. She called it a history. That word, history, bears responsibility. It means cause and consequence, ownership and legacy. She eventually sold the cabin and put the postcard in a drawer, but she kept the photo on her phone. Once, while we sat in that kitchen and the dark grew like wool, a deer passed the window and froze for a long moment, antlers caught in the sodium glow from the street. She leaned back and said, "People always want the big answer. It's the small voices that outlast us." I think that's why I keep collecting these stories. They are small voices, and they make you listen. There was one story from a caller who has since become a kind of friend. He's a volunteer with a local historical society and spends summers cataloguing cabin rosters and deeds. He called to say he'd found a ledger in a farmhouse he'd been cataloguing, names, dates, small notes, one of which matched a story I'd published months earlier, an entry about a child who had been left at a cabin and then found by a neighbor. When he matched the names and dates, he didn't write to clear up the mystery of whether they were connected to the apparition seen by one of the reunion cousins. He wrote with the quiet excitement of someone who had found an echo. He said, "Sometimes a document is just a document. Sometimes a name in a ledger is a nail in a memory." He sent a photocopy of the page and underlined part of a sentence that read, in the cramped handwriting of the time, "Heard a voice in the room calling my name." The fact that handwriting tied the present to the past made his hair stand up, and he wrote to me with the mild, scholarly terror of someone who wanted the past to be both ordinary and frightening. Far from being conclusive, these matches only increase uncertainty, which is to say, there is no single answer. Apparitions can be protective, trespassers can be very human, orbs can be guides or traps, and the most intimate voice can be the memory of a man who left and expects him to come back. The wonder and the dread coexist in the same breath. I want to tell you about one last sequence of events that folded a few of these motifs together. A family left a cabin after boots paced the floors. The sheriff found nothing. Later, a neighbor reported a power outage in the valley and some weak, corrupt footage that showed a figure standing at the window. It's the kind of cluster that makes you think there might be a through line, a prowler, a natural explanation, a bad electrical surge. But when the man who owned the property returned with a flashlight and a deputy, they found the same thin, delicate prints on the inside of the glass we've talked about before. A paw-shaped print, wet on the outside, dry on the inside. The couple had been awake with the children and had kept the lamp on. They had not imagined the paw. The deputy took photographs and wrote it off as condensation. The family left town the next morning and never collected their mail again. Months later, the deputy wrote me a short, embarrassed note saying he had no business writing to a civilian collector of stories, but he wanted to say this. He'd found a cabin once where the dog outside would sit and stare at an open field and whine, and for 3 nights the radios in the nearby houses would lose battery. He'd been a deputy for 20 years. He'd seen men who'd left town and never been found. He'd also seen things that looked like people and were not. He wrote, finally, that sometimes the work of a man is to choose whether to ask questions or to sleep. That line, about choosing questions or sleep, has been turning in my head for a long while. It's not a riddle. It's a ledger. What are you willing to lose to know? There are nights when I sit at my desk and read these letters and feel a pressure at my own back, like someone in the room, attentive. There are nights I think I hear a soft tap at the window, like a knuckle asking to be let in. Usually, it's a branch. Sometimes it's the house-like patience of my own imagination. I keep a lamp on now, not out of superstition but out of habit. Habit is not a cure. It is a way to make the world slightly more obedient. Before I close, there are practical things that people do in the face of these small violences. They bolt doors. They install better cameras, which still sometimes stop working. They sleep with the light on. They keep their phones charged. They set no trespassing signs. They have neighbors who check in. They leave offerings, coins, a cup of sugar on the step. They perform rituals, walking around a mound 3 times, knocking on the eaves, muttering the old words their grandmother taught them. These are human responses. They are not guarantees. They are, most of the time, the only weapons we have. I'll give you one last image before I go. Picture a tin roof under rain. The rain has a sound like thousands of tiny hands. On that roof, something walks. It moves in a cadence that is almost human. 1, 2, 3, 4, like the slow counting of a person who has time. Below in the room, a lamp is left on. The face of the lamp makes a pool that the figure cannot quite cross. Outside, the trees hold their breath. Inside, the house holds memory. You cannot see the thing on the roof from the bed, but you can hear it measure the distance between you and the world. That counting is a question. If you've got a cabin story of your own, tell it in the comments and subscribe for more if you dare. I read them all, and sometimes I write back. Good night, and keep whatever light you have handy.